The Slave, Part 1. Hunched over, he began the familiar journey to the riverbank, bucket in hand. Many were gathered for the same purpose, but past experience led him almost automatically to a spot close to the river's edge, one where the soil was just wet enough to be scooped, but dry enough not to run through his fingers. This had been the start to his day, every day, since he was a child. All he knew was mud, straw, bricks, and heat. So much heat. And bitterness. So much bitterness. As day in and day out, he faced the same hard labor with no end in sight, and no motivation aside from avoiding the whips and the power of the Egyptians. He grimaced as he bent down to collect the first handful of wet earth. When he was younger, this work made him strong. His broad shoulders and legs had been trained for stamina. But as he aged, the work had become endlessly painful. The yoke he used to carry bricks had molded his body so that even when it wasn't on his shoulders, its shadow remained. He was tired and moved forward only out of habit and self-preservation. But do not be fooled by this description. This man was not defined by self-pity. No, he looked around at the hundreds of men that lined the riverbank with him, young men, old men, some strong, some weak, all giving their bodies to the aesthetic of Egypt. These were God's people, promised to Abraham long ago. And they were all suffering, defined by their slavery and the pain, fear, and degradation and injustice wrapped up in that. They were bonded as a people. Bonded in their suffering, yes, but also bonded in the glimmer of hope they possessed, because hope was all they had. And this hope they knew came from the stories that had been passed down from generation to generation. Stories of a God who had chosen their ancestor Abraham, who had made promises to him of a vast people he would lead to a land of promise. This God had remained faithful to Abraham and to his descendants, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. These stories spoke of adventure and power and a relationship with this God, Elohim. They called the people to trust that God had not abandoned his promise, and one day he would remember that they too were descendants of Abraham and come to their aid. After years of hearing and telling these stories, the man had come to believe that Elohim was powerful, much more powerful than the gods the Egyptians worshipped. He believed the promised land existed, and there he and his people would finally experience relief, peace. He pictured it as he had done so many times before. His imagination saw a river, clear and quiet in its current. He saw the children laughing as they splashed, while adults waded in the water to cool off. He pictured an absence of labor, an absence of fear, a fullness of life. But when would he ever see it? The man's trust was still present, but it was taking more and more effort to keep that trust from fading. The man looked down and saw that his bucket was full. All of these thoughts, and he didn't even realize his hands had continued in the familiar rhythm of scraping and loading. He turned his attention to gathering the straw needed to make bricks. He grunted as he lifted the heavy bucket, trying not to spill its contents. But before he could move on, he heard a shout, followed by a sharp cry. He scanned the crowd and quickly spotted the Egyptian a few hundred feet away, raising his whip and cracking it down on the back of a young man. Squinting, the man tried to make out the face of the victim. The boy raised his head as the next blow struck him, and the man froze as he recognized the scruffy hair of his nephew. His nephew. And the man was stuck. Everything in him wanted to prevent that whip from striking again, but he knew if he did, the whip would turn on him. Or worse, he would be restrained while they beat his nephew harder, longer. He couldn't even stay still and try to catch his nephew's eye to let him know that he saw, that he was there for him, because standing still would draw attention. All he could do was continue moving forward at a slightly slower pace. And as he did, the familiar burning feeling of anger welled up inside. While his body had become numb to this life, his heart had not. His nephew was young, his muscles still undeveloped, not yet strong enough to bear the burden of the yoke and the bucket all day, every day. But the Egyptians didn't know, didn't care. To them, he just needed to go faster. The anger traveled to his eyes as they welled up with hot tears. And out of this anger, out of this longing, out of a lifetime of experiencing and observing the oppression of his people, his heart groaned and grasped at the only hope he had. God in heaven, the man cried out in silence. Do you not see? Do you not hear? Did you really build up a nation for this life? Is there not more for us? He trudged on one step in front of the other. Elohim, we are waiting for you. Help us, please. Help us.